Elena had always believed in the sanctity of her marriage. From the moment she said "I do" to Mark, she imagined a life built on trust, shared dreams, and quiet understanding. But tonight, as she stood in the dim glow of their living room, that illusion lay in pieces around her. She had found the messages by accident, texts and emails that painted a life she didn't know existed. Mark wasn't just cheating. He had been carefully constructing a parallel world, one that excluded her entirely. Her best friend, Sophie, was complicit, sending messages that dripped with affection, inside jokes, and promises Elena had never heard. Worse, she discovered irregularities in their shared finances. Mark had been siphoning money from their accounts, hiding debts, and investing in schemes that benefited only him. Elena confronted him that night, her voice trembling with rage and hurt. "How could you?" she demanded, her hands shaking. "Everything we built, everything I trusted you with, it was a lie." Mark looked at her and laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a guilty one, but a cruel, dismissive laugh that cut deeper than any words could. "Elena," he said, smirking, "you really think you're as clever as you believe. You've always been naive. This is life. You can't control everything." That laugh, the way it reverberated through the room, shattered something inside her. It wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. He made her pain seem laughable, her intelligence irrelevant. He didn't just cheat, he mocked her for expecting honesty. In the following days, Mark filed for divorce. Elena had expected anger, maybe negotiation, but his strategy was cold, calculated. He painted her as unstable, irrational, and incapable of managing either their wealth or their home. The lawyers he hired were sharp, hungry, and dismissive of Elena, treating her as an inconvenience rather than a person. Every call she made to them ended in frustration. Every document she signed felt like another nail in her coffin. The world seemed to turn against her, and for a moment, Elena felt powerless. But even in that darkness, a spark remained. She remembered her father's words when she was young. "When the world underestimates you, that's when you have the greatest advantage." By the time she stepped into her first consultation with a court-appointed lawyer, Elena had made a decision. She would not be humiliated. She would not be dismissed. If the system wouldn't fight for her, she would fight for herself. The idea terrified her at first, representing herself in court against someone as cunning and manipulative as Mark. But terror quickly transformed into resolve. She began to study law, poring over statutes and precedent cases late into the night, memorizing every detail she could. For the first time in weeks, she felt a measure of control returning. Mark's laughter haunted her, echoing through her mind as a constant reminder of the humiliation he had tried to impose. But Elena didn't want just revenge, she wanted justice, and she knew that one day the smirk on his face would fade. As she looked out the window at the city lights shimmering in the distance, Elena whispered to herself, not as a victim, but as someone planning a reckoning, "You think this is a game, Mark? Wait until the real fight begins." The morning air was crisp, but it did little to calm the storm inside Elena. Today, she would face Mark in court without a lawyer by her side. Representing herself was terrifying, but the thought of allowing him another victory was far worse. She had spent weeks preparing, memorizing every statute she could find, reading precedent cases, and even practicing her arguments in front of the mirror. Every word she rehearsed, every gesture she studied, was a brick in the fortress she was building around herself. When Elena stepped into the courtroom, the familiar smell of polished wood and inked paper hit her, along with the low murmur of anticipation. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, his smug expression already fixed. The faint curl of a smile played on his lips as he caught sight of her. "Representing yourself," he whispered to his lawyer, as if the idea itself was laughable. The judge called the session to order, and Elena's heart raced. She felt eyes on her from every corner, curious onlookers, the attorneys, even the court clerk. But she held her head high. She was no longer just a wife betrayed. She was a woman who refused to be humiliated. Mark's lawyer began with a confident opening statement, painting Elena as unprepared and unstable. Elena listened quietly, noting every exaggeration, every slip of logic. When it was her turn, she took a deep breath, standing firmly. Her voice was steady, even when her heart threatened to betray her. She addressed the court clearly, referencing laws and prior cases that supported her position. At first, the courtroom remained skeptical. A woman representing herself against a seasoned attorney seemed doomed. Whispers circulated, and even some of the judge's subtle glances hinted at doubt. But Elena pressed on, carefully dismantling the minor falsehoods Mark had woven into his case. She presented her evidence, highlighted inconsistencies in his statements, and remained calm even when Mark smirked or tried to interrupt. By the afternoon, the tension in the room had shifted. The spectators, once quietly judging her, now leaned in with interest. Mark's smugness began to falter under her quiet, relentless precision. Every time he tried to mock her, Elena turned it into a moment of clarity for the court, revealing his arrogance without raising her voice or losing composure. During a recess, she overheard Mark muttering under his breath, frustration creeping into his tone. He had underestimated her. His laugh, once so mocking, had been silenced by her diligence and calm. Elena realized that this wasn't just a battle for custody or money. It was a test of wills, and for the first time, she felt the scales tipping in her favor. That night, alone in her apartment, Elena allowed herself a small, quiet victory. She had survived her first day, navigated the courtroom with poise, and planted seeds of doubt about Mark's credibility. More importantly, she had discovered something within herself she hadn't recognized before: strength born from betrayal and courage fueled by injustice. As she prepared for the next day, she whispered to herself, a mixture of resolve and quiet triumph, "This is only the beginning, Mark. You laughed at me once, but you won't get that chance again." Elena went to bed knowing that the fight ahead would be grueling, but for the first time in months, she felt a sense of control. The woman Mark thought he could humiliate had emerged, and she was only beginning to reveal her true power. Elena's victory in the courtroom, though small, had ignited a fire she could no longer ignore. She realized that to truly reclaim her life, and to make Mark feel the sting of the betrayal he had inflicted, she needed more than just courage in court. She needed strategy, patience, and precision. Revenge, she decided, would be sweet, deliberate, and unavoidable. The first step was gathering evidence. Elena spent days combing through financial records, emails, and contracts that Mark had believed she would never see. She discovered hidden accounts, falsified documents, and even communications that directly tied him to schemes designed to strip her of her inheritance. Every revelation fueled her determination. Every lie Mark had spun became another weapon in her arsenal. But Elena didn't rush to use these weapons recklessly. She understood that psychological impact was just as powerful as legal proof. She started to subtly expose Mark to situations that revealed his dishonesty to others. At a social gathering with colleagues, she casually mentioned facts that only someone with insider knowledge could know, watching as Mark's confident mask cracked under the scrutiny of those around him. His face betrayed a flicker of panic, but he didn't know where the information had come from. Elena smiled inwardly. The game had begun. Meanwhile, she strengthened her own support system. Old friends who had doubted her returned, impressed by her composure and intelligence, while allies she had once overlooked now offered resources, advice, and emotional support. She rebuilt her world meticulously, showing Mark that his underestimation had been fatal. In court, Elena refined her tactics. She presented small, undeniable truths that contradicted Mark's statements. Each revelation was carefully calibrated, planting doubt without revealing her full hand. Mark tried to anticipate her moves, but Elena had studied him as closely as she had studied the law. She knew his arrogance, his tendency to overplay his strength, and the subtle ways he tried to intimidate others. She used it against him, allowing him to fall into traps of his own making. One evening, as she reviewed an old stack of emails and photographs, Elena allowed herself a quiet moment of satisfaction. She had pieced together a timeline that not only proved Mark's duplicity, but also highlighted his lack of foresight. Every scheme, every lie, every betrayal he had orchestrated now existed as irrefutable evidence, ready to be revealed at the perfect moment. This subtle, psychological revenge began to take shape outside the courtroom too. Elena allowed Mark's friends and family to witness his inconsistencies firsthand, ensuring that when the truth emerged, it would not just hurt him legally but socially. She did not seek to humiliate him publicly in a dramatic outburst. Instead, she let his own arrogance lead him into embarrassment, a slow and inevitable unraveling that echoed the pain he had inflicted on her. By the end of the chapter, Elena had become more than a wronged wife, fighting for custody and fairness. She had become a strategist, a silent storm gathering strength. Mark's laughter, which had once cut through her very soul, was now the memory of weakness, a reminder that underestimating her had been his gravest mistake. As she looked into the mirror that night, Elena didn't see the betrayed woman of a few months ago. She saw someone calm, composed, and unstoppable, a woman who would soon ensure that the man who had laughed at her would no longer have a reason to smile at all. The courtroom was tense. Thick with anticipation, Elena stood at her makeshift podium, documents neatly arranged, every piece of evidence meticulously prepared. Across from her, Mark sat with that familiar smirk, the one that had haunted her dreams for months. But now the smile seemed fragile, as if the foundation of his arrogance had begun to crumble. The judge called the session to order. Elena began calmly, her voice steady and measured. She presented the first piece of evidence, a series of financial documents proving Mark had siphoned money from their joint accounts into hidden investments. She laid out the transactions clearly, step by step, referencing legal statutes and previous rulings that reinforced her claims. The courtroom murmured as she spoke, some witnesses leaning in, captivated by her command of the facts. Mark attempted to interrupt, a condescending edge in his voice. "You can't possibly understand." Elena cut him off smoothly, her gaze unwavering. "On the contrary, I understand very clearly. I understand the law and I understand the truth." Her words, calm yet firm, seemed to hit harder than any raised voice could. Mark flinched. Next, she introduced email correspondences and testimony from colleagues who had witnessed Mark's manipulations firsthand. Each revelation chipped away at the carefully constructed persona he had maintained. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering attempts at objection, but Elena anticipated every move. She countered with evidence and logic, her preparation flawless. The courtroom began to feel different, alive, electric. Elena could see the subtle disbelief on Mark's face as the pieces fell into place. Every doubt she had planted in prior hearings had grown into seeds of suspicion. Now the truth was flowering, undeniable and public. Then came the emotional testimony. Elena spoke not just of betrayal, but of the human cost, the sleepless nights, the fear, the humiliation she had endured. Her voice didn't waver. It carried the weight of someone who had suffered yet refused to break. Mark's smirk faltered entirely as the jury absorbed the depth of his deception. Finally, Elena delivered the coup de grace, a complete timeline of Mark's lies and manipulations, linking each to specific financial and personal consequences. It was irrefutable. The courtroom was silent, the air heavy with tension. Mark tried to interject once more, but his words fell flat. His arrogance had become his undoing. The judge leaned forward, eyes intent. After a long pause, the verdict was delivered. Custody granted to Elena, fair division of assets, and recognition of Mark's deceit. Mark's jaw tightened, his face pale. His public humiliation was complete not because Elena gloated, but because the truth, undeniable and absolute, had stripped him bare. Elena exhaled, a mixture of relief and quiet triumph washing over her. She didn't feel vengeance in the petty sense. Instead, there was justice, balance restored, and dignity reclaimed. Mark's laughter, which had once cut her to the core, had been replaced by silence, an absence that spoke louder than any words could. As she walked out of the courtroom, Elena felt the weight of months of betrayal lift. She had endured, planned, and executed a battle that had transformed her from a wronged wife into a woman who could face the world with unshakable strength. The city outside shimmered in the late afternoon sun, and for the first time in months, she felt free, not just from Mark, but from the shadow of humiliation he had cast. Elena didn't look back. She had won, and in doing so, she had discovered the most important truth. Strength born of betrayal is a power no one can take away. And Mark's smile, gone forever,